Hello, everyone, and welcome to Monday Night Travel with Rick Steves Europe. Tonight, we will be venturing to one of my favorite corners of Central Europe, Poland. My name is Ben Green, and I'll be your moderator this evening. And now, I would like to actually introduce the places we are going to be visiting tonight with a flyover tour. And I had the fantastic experience, life-altering experience, of studying abroad in Krakow, Poland for 6 months in 2016. I think you will soon see why the charms of this city impressed me so much. We're also going to visit Warsaw, pretty Toruń, Malbork, and the old Hanseatic city of Gdańsk. So please hold on to your hats and be prepared to be surprised by the wonders of modern Poland. And now I would like to introduce our guidebook co-author and a guidebook researcher in this region for more than 20 years, Cameron Hewitt. Dobry wieczór, Cameron.
Dobry wieczór, Ben. Good to see you. Thanks for having me back here on Monday Night Travel. I always love to be back with the gang here, and we're in very, very capable hands with Ben, who, as he mentioned, has a personal connection to Poland, like a lot of you probably do as well. And by the way, that was some Chopin we were hearing during Ben's intro. And boy, the second I hear Chopin playing, it takes me right back to Poland. We'll talk a little bit about that coming up. Well, thank you all for joining us tonight to talk about, I think it's one of the great underrated destinations in Europe, but really one of the most fascinating, interesting, beautiful, wonderful places you can go, Poland. So I'm really thrilled to share this with you tonight. I'm going to start by giving you a couple of pictures of Poland, and then I'm going to introduce my co-host, and then we're going to take that tour together. So starting out, I just wanted to say, for a lot of Americans, maybe who have kind of an outdated idea of Poland, this might be what you imagine when you think of Poland. You think of maybe the Cold War days where everything's kind of dreary and industrial, and it's not a very pretty place. Well, I'm here to tell you, maybe that was true 30 years ago. But these days, when people go to Poland, they're absolutely stunned at what a simply beautiful place this is. This is a country that has some of the most beautiful cities and squares and architecture that you'll find anywhere in Europe. I find few places are as delightful just for exploring a beautiful place. It's also a place where new and old come together. This is the old canal along the city of Gdańsk in northern Poland. We'll be there at the end of our talk today. And you've got the old town on one side, and then the other side, you can see that they're building some super modern, brand new construction. And that's kind of what Poland is for me. There's all this beautiful old tradition. There's also a lot of modernity in Poland, and a country that you feel the metabolism of a place that's really racing towards the future. It's also a place with wonderful people. These are some of my many, on my very long list of my favorite Polish people. This is B in the driver's seat, and Robert, the bus driver for our Rick Steves Poland tour. Just two of the many Poles that I've enjoyed spending time with over the years. And this is just a wonderful place to go and connect with the people. Rick and I have been both really passionate about Poland for many, many years. I'm coming up on a guidebook research trip. I'm leaving very soon to go back to Poland. We're going to be updating the material in our guidebook, which I first wrote about 20 years ago. I think it's the 20th anniversary of when we first had a guidebook section on Poland back in 2003. And I'm very excited to be back there soon, updating that material post-pandemic. Rick loves Poland as well, but he doesn't have as much time to travel as I do beyond the kind of core of Europe. So he entrusts me to do a lot of our work in Poland. And that's been really fun over the years for me to get to do that year after year and get to know so many wonderful people. The other thing we're really excited about this year, I think I'm kind of breaking a little news here, but we're heading to Poland, me and Rick and our camera operator, Carl, in the middle there, and Simon Griffith, our producer. We are heading back to Poland in September to do two brand new Rick Steves Europe television shows about Poland. We're going to do 2 30-minute episodes. Now, hold your horses. It takes a long time to produce these things. These are the first 2 shows of a new season. It might be even a couple of years before these actually hit your airwaves. But rest assured, we're very passionate and excited about Poland. And this September, we're going to be filming to tell people about what a wonderful place this is. And, you know, Rick and Simon and Carl, they filmed in Poland. I think it was also around 2003, 2004, about 20 years ago. And we watched that old show and we said, this is a destination that really needs an update in terms of the TV. This is a place that's changed a lot over that time. Poland is a really thriving place that's fun to kind of see how much it's changed, even over just the last few years, much less the last 20 years. And the other thing we're really excited about, just last year, we started our brand new Best of Poland tour in 10 days. We were supposed to do this for the first time in 2020, but like everything else in 2020, including those Poland TV shows, that got canceled for the pandemic. But we finally got back at it. And it was really fun for me to go over there and work with a team of wonderful guides on this tour. We'll tell you a little bit more about the tour at the end of the talk, but just rest assured, everything we talk about here tonight is covered on our brand new Rick Steves Best of Poland in 10 Days tour. This is our second year doing it. And last May, I went over there and I worked with a team of amazing Polish guides. This was a very lucky tour because they had 4 Polish tour guides plus me in tow. And one of the tour guides I really got to know well is someone who we already knew a little bit as a local guide, but now he's a tour guide extraordinaire for our Best of Poland tour. And that is our guest host tonight, or co-host, and that is Tomasz Klimek. I'm going to go to full screen and let Tomasz introduce himself live from Krakow. Tomasz, how are you?
Hello, welcome from Krakow. This is really a pleasure for me to be with you, Cameron, and with you, Ben, that I consider like 2 greatest ambassadors of Poland over the West Coast. So I'm really happy we'll be talking about Poland today. I'm having my hat on. So this is not a cook's hat, not a waiter's hat, part of a traditional Krakowian dress that over the years has become a national dress. And we still use it. We still put it on special occasions, as this is a special occasion, as we are talking on Poland on this Monday night travel. So I decided to put it on, peacock feather on the top, and it's just a part of it. So I'm really happy to be here.
Krakowiak hat, right?
It's Krakowiak, and it's such a strong symbol that you even see it like on the bottle of the beer, Żywiec.
Ah, yeah. By the way, speaking of beer, Tomasz and I both stocked up on local Polish goodies. So you've got the original Żywiec, and I've got the Żywiec Białe, which is the white version of Żywiec. And by the way, if you're struggling with the Polish language, we're not going to give you a lot of help tonight, but just trust me, that's pronounced Żywiec. So Tomasz, let's talk about, before we get into our travelogue and talking about Poland, you and I think both had a lot of fun the last few days, getting a lot of food and drink items that we wanted to share with our viewers tonight. So where do you want to start with should we start with the pierogi?
Yeah, I always say that getting to know the culture through its food is always like one of the best ways. And of course, if you think of Poland, if you ask like 100,000 Poles, what is the most typical Polish dish? You get 100,000 answers, pierogi. So of course, I have them just freshly boiled on this Polish pottery. That I love yours, Cameron, too. Yeah, so we are on the same page here very well. We'll eat them shortly. So, of course, pierogi is number 1, and nothing can beat that.
And this is the Polish. It's from. Is it Bolesławiec? Am I saying that right?
Mm-hmm.
The famous Polish pottery. Let's see. What other food? I'm going to bite into mine here while you tell us about the next item. By the way, I got all of my items. And if you're tempted by this food, a lot of American cities have really good Polish delis or Polish grocery stores. There's a couple here in Seattle. I went to one called European Foods that's up in Shoreline along 99. And I walked in this weekend to get ready for this show, and they had handmade pierogi, which this is a cheese-filled pierogi. And everything else I'm about to show you is from that store as well. So if you've been to Poland or you just love Polish food, whether you're in Seattle or not, a lot of cities have a Polish supermarket or a Polish grocery store. For most of what you're going to see here is available there. But I'm going to have a bite of this. You tell us about the next item you got there, Tomasz.
So, how to chop a pole? Another way would be pączek. So like a Polish donut that has no hole inside, as you can see. The most traditional version of it is with the rose marmalade. However, nowadays, many things can go inside. And this is such an important dish that we eat it on, actually a few weeks ago, we had this Thursday before the Lent starts. Everyone eats pączki. We organize a special competition for the best pączki in town. So it's really a big deal.
So Fat Tuesday, you have pączki, and pretty much every other day too.
Yes, pretty much every other day, but this is the day where everywhere you go, any office, any school, any institution, there are always pączki there, okay, on the table. So this is a day where you just cannot go through without having at least 7
And we've got jelly donuts here, but the ones that I think of that are really distinctive, you mentioned, it's a rose flavored jam. So it's got a very floral, pungent aroma. I have a couple of my own Polish treats here. I went to this store and I picked up a couple of Prince Polo bars, which doesn't sound Polish, but trust me, these are every Polish kid grew up eating these. They're kind of these wafer cookies dipped in chocolate. I have a friend who was in the Peace Corps in Slovakia, and he refers to these as commie candy because he talks about how back when people our age were growing up in communist Poland, they ate this kind of thing. So it's commie candy, but Prince Polo is the big brand name you see everywhere. And then I also have another very special delicacy. I found a box at this store of ptasie mleczko, which means bird's milk. Am I right about that, Tomasz?
That is correct.
It's like a marshmallow that's dipped in chocolate. And tell us, this is by the way, Emil Wedel, which is the kind of the Cadbury or the Hershey's of Poland. Tell us a little bit about why this is important.
So Poland has a pretty big tradition and generally sweet and chocolate, and we have a lot of companies, they still do the traditional version. Another delicacy you can find, we call it delicie. It's actually delicious. This is how you translate it. It's again chocolate topped with some jelly inside and a biscuit at the bottom, and there are like many different ways how to eat them. So we actually have like teams of people who first eat the chocolate, teams of people who first eat the biscuit from the bottom. So in every family there will be the way of having the delicie, and when this appears in our house, it's gone like in 10 seconds.
I looked for delicie at the store. They didn't happen to have any, but it's kind of like Jaffa cakes. If you've been in Britain, I think there's other places that have Jaffa cakes. That's kind of what the delicie is. By the way, I'm gonna have another one. These bird's milk, ptasie mleczko, are just absolutely delicious because they're marshmallow inside. So they just kind of melt in your mouth. Really good. What other food? Oh, we were going to talk about. I have something that is extremely American. Not only do I have a bagel, but I have an everything bagel. Tomasz, have you heard of an everything bagel? Do you know what that is?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can kind of imagine, yes, everything you guys can put on the top.
It's very American. It's just basically, can we think of everything we can possibly cram onto the top of a bagel? We're going to do it. But you were telling me that this is a very American thing, but tell us about the similar food you've got there in Krakow.
So was it invented in America? Probably not. The idea was brought over from where? From Poland, because in Poland we have something that we call obwarzanek. Obwarzanek, if you want to practice some of your Polish language skills, which is like a great-grandfather of a bagel. How was that? We know that in 1300s, this is already produced as a royal snack for the court, for the king. So there were actually designated bakeries that would do it for the king with the special license. You have to know that until today, they do it with the special license, but now for us, daily around 150,000 of obwarzanek are being sold on the streets of Krakow. And interestingly, this is only sold in the city of Krakow. So it's like registered by both Polish and European Union law as a local snack where nowhere else outside of Krakow you're able to get it. So great grandfather of a bagel.
And very often they're in, I want to say they're like blue. They look like a blue aquarium on wheels. If you walk down the street corner, there's big glass cases that are full of those obwarzanki, and they're really delicious. And then to wrap up the food, we both have some drinks here. We'd already talked about the Żywiec, which is one of the main brands of Polish beer. And do you have anything else drinkable? Anything else that you can maybe toast with while we're here in Poland?
So another must and another thing that you think of Poland is, of course, vodka. Okay, yes, we are a country of vodka, and generally vodka is a very special, it's not just a drink, it's more like a social thing. You don't drink vodka with just anyone, you drink vodka with that you respect. And of course, we have many, many different types of vodka. And today I'm having one of my favorite that is called Krupnik, which is like a honey and herb vodka. That honey makes it a little bit milder if you're not such a great fan of the very bitter vodka taste. So I highly recommend it. It's delicious. It is. You can drink it in shots. You can drink it also with warm water and squeeze lemon. That's how it's being served in the bar, which is, by the way, the thing to put you up if you are suffering with some maybe cold or flu.
Yeah, I remember when we did that tour together, somebody had a tickle in their throat, and you pulled them aside very seriously. Says we gave them a COVID test. They didn't have COVID, but they had a cold, and we said, you were like, here's what you're going to do. You don't go to the pharmacy. You go to the liquor store. It sells alcohol, the big sign, and you buy some of that vodka, and you put it in a glass with some hot water and some lemon juice. And you said that would take care of the cold. And I think that's probably as effective as things you can buy at the pharmacy.
And it worked. So
yeah, I remember that. Yeah. Okay, have we gone through all of our edible Poland bits and pieces?
Probably would be nice to add. I'm not sure with all the sweet things would be kiełbasa, the Polish sausage.
Of course, we don't have any with us, but yeah, it's funny. We know that word. Even Americans know kielbasa. That's been kind of adopted into the American vernacular as well. But of course, Poland is a land of great sausages. And we'll talk maybe a little bit more about some of the specialties. But I think in terms of what we're actually eating tonight, I think we've kind of covered it. And by the way, feel free to take your hat off if you want to make yourself comfortable. It looks fairly comfortable, but you know.
We put the head on special occasions. You don't want to kind of mess with your traditional food, clothes and food. So yes, let me take it off for now.
Okay, good. Great. Well, we're going to go dive in and go back to our slideshow and tell you a little bit more together about Poland. And we're going to start just with sort of introducing Poland. So Tomasz and I are going to just have a little conversation about Poland in general and about some specific places. There's Poland, right? Almost close to the very middle of Europe. You can see it's just east of Germany. And there's a couple of ways in which Polish geography has really impacted its history and its culture. And that is, there's two things really. One is that Poland is very flat. Now we're going to see some pictures later of some mountains in the south, but most of Poland is extremely flat. The other thing about Poland is it's between the Germanic world and the Russian world. You can see Russia and Belarus and Ukraine and all of that is just to the east of Poland. So it's kind of sandwiched between two of the great traditional powers of Europe. And that means there's been a lot of war and fighting and push and pull going back and forth through Poland. So it's got a very kind of tumultuous history. And you see a lot of stories when you're in Poland, big epic paintings. This is by Jan Matejko, who's the great Polish kind of battle scene and historical scene painter, just depicting these incredible blowout battles of the Middle Ages. So Polish history is very, very tumultuous. And very epic. And so it's a place that if you're interested in history, it's a very rewarding place. This is the Battle of Grunwald, if I'm not mistaken, Tomasz, is that right?
That is correct.
And I think maybe because of that, a lot of people ended up leaving Poland. And so something else that I think of when I think of Poland is there's a lot of us Polish Americans. My grandfather's parents, my great-grandmother and great-grandfather, both came from pig farming villages just about an hour and a half east of Krakow, where Tomasz lives. And, you know, anybody from any background, I think, can really enjoy Poland. There's a lot to offer. But I think for those of us who have Polish ancestry, there's sort of a special connection, and it gives us insight maybe into who we are a little bit and who our family is and maybe some of our traditions. And when Tomasz and I did this tour last year, we knew there'd be a lot of interest among Polish American people. But actually, about half of the people on that first tour, so out of the 20-some people, 10 or 12 of them had Polish ancestry, including this woman here. And it was kind of fun for them to be back in some cases, they'd never actually been to Poland. Some of them even grew up speaking Polish in the home and had never actually been to Poland. So it was really exciting for them to be able to come and be in Poland and kind of feel connected to that culture. And that's certainly how I feel when I'm traveling in Poland. Something else that I connect with Poland is the Catholic faith is extremely important to the Polish people, both sort of as their religion, but also some ways as their cultural identity. Like during communism, the Polish people really their devotion to Catholicism was a way that they kind of protested against the communist regime. Tomasz, do you want to talk a little bit about how does being Catholic connect with being Polish?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so definitely there's still big impact, but what you mentioned, like during those difficult times, the church was always like supportive of the changes, of the freedom of the people. It never hooked up with any of the regimes that it was happening in some other countries. So maybe this is the reason why it's still sort of strong, even though it's changing. It's still percentage-wise is something that cannot be seen anywhere else in Europe. And truly, under the communism, like going to church was like a sign of rebel. So even if you were not religious, you would be just going to church to sort of show and do some statements, because after the mass, the people would be just kind of meeting, intellectuals talking. So this was like a center of the opposition at the same time. So it's always been there. Krakow, by the way, 135 churches. So this is like the second largest after Rome. That's why the people call it sometimes the Altra Roma. By the way, the church you'll be seeing here right now, it's built on the plans of Rome's Church Il Gesù. So it's another like argument calling Krakow's the other Rome.
And, as a traveler, when I go to Poland, I really am aware of how important the faith is, because there's a lot of Catholic countries in Europe, like Italy or Spain or Portugal, and you go into the churches, and certainly there are worshipers there, but it feels like it's kind of a beautiful tourist attraction, and there's a few people practicing, worshiping in one corner. But when I'm in Poland, I really notice that the churches are full of people who are actively worshiping. They're there to pray. And so I'm especially mindful in Poland to be very discreet. If I'm visiting a church, visitors are welcome, especially if there's no services going on. But you do have to keep a low profile. And I think that's something to tune into as a traveler visiting Poland. And then, of course, there's another piece to the Polish heritage, which is Judaism. This was traditionally the home to a huge part of the European Jewish population. That goes back to a great medieval king called Kazimierz the Great. When other lands and kingdoms were persecuting and expelling Jewish people, Kazimierz the Great actually invited them to come in Poland, which isn't to say that they were necessarily treated as equals or that they had some great life here, but they were more welcome here than a lot of places. And that continued all the way through the Holocaust, unfortunately. And we'll talk a little bit later in the talk about some of the places where you can learn about the Jewish heritage and sort of tease out that strand of Polish history. And then something else that really strikes me as a traveler, I always think of Poland as being kind of like Spain. If you've been to Spain, it's a very big country, 40 million people, and a lot of space. And there's sort of this sharp contrast where you have really big, fascinating, interesting, vibrant cities. And then you have lots of little villages and kind of farming communities in the countryside. And there's not a lot in between. There are, of course, small towns and smaller cities. But I find a big contrast between the urban Krakow, urban Poland, which has a certain feeling to it and a real modern vitality, and then the very traditional, idyllic, romantic, bucolic countryside. Would you say that's a fair characterization, Tomasz?
Well, generally, Poland is very rural. As you said in the beginning, it's mainly flat country, but not only flat in terms of the surface, but also it's a very good soil. So agriculture is still a very important part of our economy, which, of course, decides on what you've just said. So it's very much rural country. Okay, so there are some big cities, rural countries. Those smaller towns, they would appear from time to time, but I would say they have the least charm. So yeah, big cities and rural.
I think you're right, for sure. And for travelers in particular, I've always sort of struggled for my guidebook to find the small town in Poland, like Český Krumlov in the Czech Republic or something. And it's hard to find a small town or a small city that has a lot of charm. The big cities, which we'll mainly be talking about today, have tons of charm and tons of interest, but there's a lot of rural area in between. So anyway, that's just to give you a picture of Poland. And now we're going to get into sort of a destination by destination tour of Poland. We're going to go through some of the main sites in the country. And Tomasz and I are going to take turns telling you a little bit about each place. We're going to start there down in the south, Krakow, which is where Tomasz lives. And for a lot of people, it's sort of the one place they go. If they've been one place in Poland, it's very likely Krakow, because it's just a beautiful town, very accessible, easy to see. And there's lots of very convenient day trips right near Krakow that we'll also talk about. Further up, right in the middle of the country, then we'll go to the capital city of Warsaw, which is the modern capital city of Poland. And it has a very different feel. It's not quite as traditional and romantic old town. It's sort of the urban, modern, kind of urbane vitality. Lots of hipsters running around and people really dressed well between business meetings on the streets of Warsaw. And then from there, by the way, we're going to follow the Vistula River. You can see, if you look at the map, there's a faint blue line that kind of makes an S through the middle of Poland with Warsaw right in the middle. That goes through Krakow. We're going to follow it up through Warsaw. It just so happens all the great cities of Poland are along this river. We're going to end up where it exits out into the Baltic Sea in Gdańsk, up in the far north of Poland. And we'll stop off at a couple other smaller places. Toruń, which is between Gdańsk and Warsaw, if you're looking for that sort of smaller city, it's still a city, but a slightly smaller city that does have a lot of charm, that's a great choice. And then Malbork Castle up near Gdańsk. And we're going to start off in Tomasz's hometown, Kraków, as they say in Polish, or Krakow, as we Americans say. And I just have to say, there's a good reason why this is the one place. If people go to one place in Poland, like I said, it's probably Krakow, and for very good reason. And I just want to start, Tomasz, by talking about the main market square, which for my money might be the best, most beautiful, most inviting, most charming, most enjoyable to explore, most enjoyable to just sit out and nurse a beer square anywhere in Europe. So tell me, as someone who lives there, tell me what gets you excited about that square. What is it? What's so special about it?
So you should know that this is the largest medieval market square of Europe. Okay, so the size is also something important, the charm, and also something that we should mention at this point is that Krakow is the place, one of the very few in Poland that was left intact during those difficult times of First World War, Second World War. So everything you see on the square around the old town is authentic, is original, which also influences on the ambience of the place. So I have to tell you, I'm in love with my city, and whenever I come back from some family travel, I just go run to the market square, do a round up there, and then I feel like at home.
I mean, I'm the same. For me, Krakow feels like a second home, and not only because my ancestors came from near here, but it might be the one place in Europe. It's probably the city in Europe I've been to the most times, and maybe even the most number of days in my whole life. I spent so much time here. Feels like home to me too. And I'm with you. When I get back to Krakow, whether it's been a couple months or coming up in this next trip, maybe even a couple, 3 years, walking through that square and just taking it all in again is just such a special experience. I mean, it's really just a magical place. So you're very lucky to get access to this kind of all the time. And the other thing I like about Krakow in general is it's very walkable. It's a very strollable city. It's a big city actually, but the old town is quite compact. And that's the part that, as Tomasz is saying, is incredibly well preserved. It's just like a museum of architecture, untouched by the ravages of war that have really shaped so much of the rest of Poland. And it's all beautifully contained within the old wall, which has now been replaced with this park where there's kind of lots of benches and places to sit and relax, and gardens and cafes. And it's just for being such a big city, once you're in that old town that's very kind of buffered from the urban part of the city, it's just super fun and relaxing.
Yes, Krakow is also listed on the UNESCO list of World Natural Cultural Heritage, which is not that unique anymore because there are thousands of sites and objects. But you have to know, when the UNESCO list started back in 1978, it only had 12 sites, and Krakow was one of the first 12. So it was an important decision to say that this is an important place, not only for us here locally, but also globally for the humanity. And also, as we looking at the bar, I have to know that since 2017, European Union has been giving a title of the culinary capital of Europe, and the first ever title went to Krakow.
Wow, I didn't know that actually. I'm not surprised though. It's a great food city.
Our French and Italian friends were going like, "What? Krakow?" Yes.
Everyone in Lyon and Bologna, where they had steam coming out of their ears. But I get it. It's a great city. And I think another reason it's so important and how it shows up on all these cultural heritage lists is now these days, Warsaw is the capital of Poland, but historically it was Krakow that was the capital of Poland. And down at the southern tip of this old town, so really from that main square, it's a 10, 15-minute walk at a leisurely pace. You come to this place, it's called Wawel. And it's a hill where you find the traditional castle of the Polish kings up until about 500 years ago, more or less. And then you also have Wawel Cathedral, which is the main cathedral, as we've learned. This is a country and a people for whom Catholicism is extremely important. And if you think this is their main cathedral for Polish Catholics, this is sort of the Westminster Abbey of Poland. And I mean, as a tour guide, how do you present Wawel to people? Do you think this is an exciting place for people to see?
So sometimes we use the term the place where heart of Poland beats, because that's what it is. It's one of the most important places, not only in Krakow, but in the whole country. And not only because of the religious aspect that you just mentioned, but also because of those political, patriotical aspect, because inside this cathedral, not only Polish kings were crowned and they are buried, but also our national heroes, our national poets, generals, all those people who throughout the centuries have contributed to what is Poland today are there. So you could truly cover the full Polish history in relatively small place. So
yeah, I'll give you a heads up. So Rick and I were just going back and forth about the script for these new Poland TV shows. And we've got a section about Wawel. And we start rattling off Jan Sobieski and King Jadwiga and Kazimierz the Great and all of these great Polish kings and queens. And I think Rick is sort of debating how many of these Polish names is too many. Tadeusz Kościuszko, you know, how many of these Polish names is too many? We got to figure out a way to make this accessible, because you could just, I've been with Tomasz and other guides like Tomasz in the crypt of this cathedral. And it's just, it's actually very, you get carried away with the passion of the Polish people for their history. As I said earlier, there's this kind of epic history and all these great figures and heroes, and a lot of them are buried in this cathedral. So that's really exciting. Yeah, actually, my family name is Dąbrowski, and everyone tells me when I'm in Poland that there is a General Dąbrowski, to whom I am probably not related, but there is a General Dąbrowski who's mentioned in the Polish national anthem. So I'm distantly related to, potentially, or at least have the same name as, one of these great Polish heroes. And then we were talking about the Wawel Cathedral being so important and churches being so important. And I would say from like a sightseeing point of view, there's some beautiful churches. This is the Franciscan church. We also saw the St. Mary's Church, which is that one with the two towers on the old town square. If you're sightseeing, any of these churches, or maybe all of these churches, are worth dipping into. Tomasz, do you have, what are some of your other favorite museums or sites or attractions that you recommend to people if they're exploring Krakow?
So if you're in Krakow, you want to go deeper into the history, you can go underneath the level of the market square. There's this great museum that we call just underground market. During the archaeological works, they just started to find out about the history, and this museum is a sort of side effect of those works. But it's amazing because the level of the city has gone up around 15 to 18 feet. So whatever was underground was kind of covered. We didn't know about it, and we find out only recently. So you can take a travel in time and space, actually, once you go down to this museum. Very accessible, easy to be done on your own, because it has a lot of touchscreens, presentations in different languages. So this will be something I would truly recommend.
Yeah, I think that's a great museum. I know the one you're talking about. The other thing, though, speaking of the kind of Catholicism and the religion and the traditions of Krakow, Tomasz, when we were brainstorming for this talk, there's all these different local traditions and customs that he wanted to talk about. So we decided to narrow it down, and I think this one sounds really cool. So tell us what we're looking at here, Tomasz.
So in Krakow, for nearly 100 years now, we have this tradition of making those nativity scenes in the form of like architectural objects. And you're looking at some of the examples right now. What are those? Nativity scene, it's for Christmas, and oh, that's a great picture. They're supposed to resemble the architecture of Krakow in a way. And every year, first Thursday of December, in different categories, those beauties are being exposed to the people, are being presented to the people. So this is a picture, it looks like a Photoshop, but it's not. It was actually taken on the main market square, where on the statue of our national poet, those objects are being presented, and in different categories, they are being judged, and they receive the rewards. It's quite a lot of money in some of the cases. And then for many months, they can be seen both in the museum and on the streets of Krakow. Amazing tradition that has a lot of like personal stories of the authors, of the artists that make them. So truly, if you are there around winter time, this is something that you will see on the streets of Krakow a lot.
And my sense is the whole calendar of the year of Krakow, there's things like this going on all the time. In fact, I happen to be there coming up on my trip. I'll be there on Easter, and I think Tomasz is going to show me a few of the, just for fun, so a few of the Easter traditions while I'm in Krakow. I'm really excited about that. It'll be exciting to be back in Krakow at such a festive time of year. Another thing, by the way, that's really fun to do in Krakow, and this is something we do on our tours, but also Tomasz has a tour company. I'll just put in a plug right now called Krakow Urban Tours that does these kinds of really fun experiential tours for independent travelers as well. But we did this on our tour last year, and that is you can go shopping in the market and buy your ingredients to learn how to make pierogi. And so the first thing you do is you go to the market and they give you a list of the things you need to buy from the different merchants. And this is not a tourist market. There's this old market, they call it, and it's tucked just outside of the ring road surrounding the old town. And it's very local, and it's just kind of rustic people who just brought their stuff in from the farm fields that morning. And you go around and you buy all of the ingredients, and then you go into a local home. In my case, I was lucky enough to be in Tomasz's home. And then he teaches you how to, from scratch, make this fantastic dish, pierogi, that we were sampling earlier. And it's very traditional, incredibly delicious. I remember, Tomasz, this was one of my favorite experiences on my tour, and maybe one of my favorite experiences I've ever had in Krakow or in Poland. And everybody who did it, it was just so much fun also being in these smaller groups within our bigger group. We'd all split up and go into a different family home and do this. And I think that there's something really nice about Poland. It has this really rich culture it's fun to kind of get your fingers dirty with it, right? It's one thing to go to museums, but I think Poland is a place where you really want to find a way to connect with the culture. So I just say thank you for setting that up. I think it's such a cool program.
You're very welcome. I always say that like hands-on experience is something that you always remember the most, that you can refer to. What could be more local than like going to someone's home and making this traditional a national dish? So that's what we do. And for us, it's also a great experience to meet people from all over the world and just be able to share a part of our culture with them.
It was also fun too, because we did, like I said, we had quite a few folks who had a Polish ancestry, and some of them were like, oh yeah, my grandma taught me how to make this, way back when. And it was kind of fun for them to reconnect that as well. So, and pierogi is such an important part of the culture. It kind of ties everything together, I think. Speaking of food, we've already talked a little bit about the vodka. We've talked about the obwarzhanek, the Polish bagel, which is more delicious and certainly less filling than the American everything bagel. Let's talk about a few more foods that people can try. This is a street food. It's really good in Krakow, but I think it's other places too. Tell us a little bit about, it looks like a French bread pizza, but it's not exactly that. Tell us about this, Tomasz.
So the name of the snack is zapiekanka. And this is one of those snacks that again goes back to the communist times, because what is it? It's like an open bagel, baguette, like a piece of bread with cheese and mushroom on it, put into the oven and ready to eat. So it's warm, it's quite filling, as you can see, quite warm, quite large, and it can be seen all over Poland. Zapiekanka, they even sell it on the gas stations, they sell it everywhere. It's good to know where to go for the best ones, and we have a couple of places in Krakow that we recommend to our guests when they come. And this is something that we still do at home. So it's like a street food sort of, but with a home origin.
Yeah, I love these little local street foods. And the first time I saw one of these, I couldn't figure out what it was. But once you've had a couple, it's one of those things you acquire taste for. And it's a great kind of a meal on the go when you're out and about. We talked a little bit about Polish sausage. I think, Tomasz, there's so much to say about Polish food. Let's each maybe talk about one or two dishes that we really like. I'll start with my favorite dish. I'm a borscht connoisseur. And when I'm in Poland, it's like when I'm in Italy, not a day goes by that I don't try a gelato, maybe 2 gelatos. But when I'm in Poland, it's borscht, because they're all a little bit different. Some of them have dumplings like this one. Some of them are clear, don't have anything in them. Some of them can be the Ukrainian style can be really chunky. It has lots of vegetables and beans in it. And I just love, if you haven't had borscht, it's this savory beet soup. And it's just absolutely delicious, super satisfying on a cold day or really anytime. So that's kind of my favorite quick pickup meal. So for me, that's a big one. Tell us a little bit more about Polish food and what are some of your favorite dishes, Tomasz?
So generally, like if you want to speak about Polish food, you have to look at the climate, okay? And yes, we would not be able to survive on this nice Mediterranean diet. So Polish food is heavy, it's greasy, it's saucy, it's meaty, the carbs. You need this energy to warm you up, to help you, to give you the energy to work. But it's still, on the other hand, it's very much comfort food because it's always made from scratch. So it's not a processed food. It's always made from those fresh ingredients from the market usually. So yes, there are plenty of dishes. Borscht is also one of my favorite soup, but if we were to mention one more soup, I would say żurek. Żurek is sometimes being translated in the menus as this traditional sour soup. It's very difficult to explain the flavor. You just have to try it. But it's just
it tastes kind of like if sourdough bread were liquid. It's got that kind of savory, sour. Oh man, it's so good. I love żurek.
Yes, and it's. I think we are the only country that serve that. So even in the neighboring countries, nowhere else you find żurek. So this is definitely a soup that you should try. Our soups are always quite filling. They come with potatoes, they come with egg, they come with sausage. So they could be like a whole meal actually. And another dish that if we were to mention, potato pancakes. They are quite popular, easy to make and accessible everywhere. And one dish that you might want to try, it's called bigos, which sometimes they translate as to hunter stew, which is a fermented cabbage with meat, with sausage, with a lot of spices that is boiled for many days as like a one bowl type of meal that you can prepare for the whole family for a couple of days. Not many restaurants would have that, so you have to know where to go. But if you have a chance to try it, bigos, Bigos, I highly recommend it.
I love bigos. I agree with you. And it's someone explained it to me once, not in the flavor profile, but just in kind of the sort of the dishes. It's kind of like chili in the US, meaning everybody has their own recipe. You can kind of throw in whatever's in the pantry. Sometimes it has more meat, sometimes it has more vegetables. Everyone's got their own way of doing it, but it's very satisfying. It's always super delicious. And like you said, it's not that easy to find in restaurants. So if you see bigos on the menu in a restaurant, you should definitely give it a try. Any other final thoughts on food before we move on to other topics? You're making me hungry. I just had another pierogi.
Oh, yeah. So we spoke of vodka, and you know that's what goes well with vodka is herring. So this is something that you find a lot in Poland. It's a kind of old traditional way that is now being kind of revitalized, herring being served in those many interesting modern ways. And there are certain bars that kind of specialize in herring and vodka serving. So this is something you do get to see a lot.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you're right. 10 or 15 years ago, you didn't see it as much, but it's a very old traditional food, herring, and it wasn't really current for a while. But you're right. There's this relatively new trend now where there's all these bars that are kind of popping up that are kind of herring bars, and it's a good thing to go with the vodka. Man, well, good. Thank you for giving us a rundown of a few more Polish foods. But we've got a lot more to cover in Poland. And one thing we wanted to talk about next was a particular neighborhood of Krakow. This is about, maybe a 15, 20-minute walk from the old town or a quick tram ride. And it's the neighborhood called Kazimierz. Now, it's known mainly for its Jewish heritage, which we'll talk about in a moment. But what's interesting about Kazimierz is it's also kind of a very trendy hipster neighborhood these days. And so you have this sort of interesting dynamic in the same streets, in the same area. You've got these synagogues and cemeteries from the old Jewish heritage, but you've also got like food truck pods and like really trendy restaurants. So Kazimierz is kind of a fascinating place to see both of those things. But specifically, the reason you might be familiar with Kazimierz, or it might look familiar, is this was the location where Schindler's List, the events of Schindler's List actually took place. And it's also where they filmed the movie. Steven Spielberg actually came back here and chose to film that story in the place that it actually happened. And until that time, under communism, the whole Jewish story of Poland kind of got brushed under the rug, like a lot of things under communism. If it wasn't part of what the regime's messaging was, it just got kind of forgotten and pushed to the edges. And it was actually Schindler's List, as I understand it, that helped revitalize interest in this old Jewish quarter. And now you've got all of these various synagogues that have reopened in some cases after being partially deserted or destroyed for many years. They've reopened and they've been turned into museums. And in a lot of cases, they actually have a practicing congregation as well. And you also have these very poignant graveyards and cemeteries. And in this case, when the Nazis did occupy Krakow, which is what the Krakow that you see if you watch Schindler's List, they actually destroyed a lot of the Jewish cemeteries. They ran their tanks through the cemeteries and destroyed all the headstones. And so in some of these cemeteries, you see these fragments of headstones that have been fitted back together into kind of a mosaic. It's really interesting that this is just right there in the outskirts of Krakow, Tomasz.
Yeah, that's correct. And it's also kind of symbolic because you can see the culture being rebuilt from the pieces. That's what the slide shows you. So there's a great like rebirth and sort of reactivation of the Jewish culture, both in the cultural and religious sense, which is super unique. There are 7 pre-war synagogues that are still standing in this neighborhood. So definitely, if you're interested in this part of the history, that's a place you should not miss.
And of course, a big piece of that story, unfortunately, the reason that it's sort of something that has to be preserved and brought back is that when the Nazi Germany occupied Poland, they used the space that they had in Poland as a place to build a lot of their most notorious concentration camps, including Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, which is just an hour and 15 minutes, hour and a half drive outside of Krakow. So it's a very popular day trip for people who want to kind of, some people say you shouldn't say make a pilgrimage because that implies a holy place. But for a lot of people who go here, it really feels like a pilgrimage in terms of you have a sense of obligation and a responsibility to learn the story. And having been here a lot with our tours, I can tell you it's just a very powerful site to walk through. It's a huge area. You see all these iconic sites like this Arbeit-macht-frei, which literally translates in German as the work will set you free, which was a cruelly sarcastic message on the part of the Nazi Germans who ran the place. But there's actually 2 parts to Auschwitz. First is Auschwitz I, the main camp. This was actually a Polish military barracks. And now those brick buildings have been turned into incredibly powerful, just wrenching museums where you can, for example, walk into a hall that's just filled floor to ceiling with these suitcases. And if you remember the stories that you might have seen in Schindler's List or documentaries or learned about in history books, they told the Jewish inmates to write their names on their suitcases before they were sent to the gas chambers, believing that they would reclaim the bags later on. And of course, instead, they were just rifled through and plundered and thrown away or burned or whatever. You can actually see some of those actual items in these museums. And then the second part of the camp, which is a mile or so away, is called Birkenau. And this was actually custom built by the Nazis as sort of the tour guides there like to say it's sort of a factory for the mass production of death. It was basically designed to do nothing but house people until they could be killed and their bodies burned in these 4 giant crematoria that were on the outside edge of Birkenau. And it's just incredibly powerful to go and see these places and stand, for example, this is the famous notorious dividing platform, looking back at the gatehouse of the Birkenau part of the camp. And if, again, you've probably seen this dramatized at some point, a Nazi doctor would stand here as these train cars would pull up and the prisoners would be unloaded. And the doctor would take one look at each person and he would point in one direction, which meant that they would be sent directly to the gas chambers. But if they looked healthy and able to work, he would point the other direction, which meant they would be basically checked in as inmates and allowed to live a little bit longer as long as they could be useful and actually do labor. And this was the place where, in a lot of those stories we saw, families were torn apart forever. Literally, one set of the family would go in one direction, the other in the other, and they would never see each other. This is just an incredibly powerful place to visit. And I think for a lot of people, it's a difficult place to visit, but it's very important. And it's maybe the best place I've seen anywhere. If you really want to understand the story of what happened during the Holocaust, this is just an incredibly powerful place to do it. Tomasz, what are your thoughts on this? As a tour guide who takes people here a lot, how do you think about this place? How do you present it to people?
So this place is definitely nothing to enjoy, that's for sure. But I always say a must be done because there's a saying that if you don't learn the history well, it likes to be repeated. So the whole idea of having this museum is so this story is never, ever repeated again. And also us, the guides, taking the people there, for us, it's more like a mission, okay, to tell the story, to educate. We go there a lot with the youngsters from all different parts of the world. And sometimes it's for the first time they hear the story. So I think it's very important and to go there for education in this case. And it is happening, and I think it's very good.
Yeah, and as I said, Auschwitz is one reason we mention it right now is it's close enough to Krakow that it's very common for people staying in Krakow to devote a day to go out there. And there's various ways you can do that. You can join a tour, you can hire a local driver, local tour guide to take you there door to door and set everything up for you so you have a smooth visit. You can take public transportation. But I would say if you're going to Krakow, make a point to set aside a day to go out to Auschwitz. It's a very powerful experience and a very important one, as Tomasz is saying. There are some other day trips that I would suggest if you're going to be in Krakow, other things that might interest you. And one of them is actually just a neighborhood just on the outskirts of Krakow. That's a really good place to learn about this communist heritage that we've talked about. Tomasz, tell us a little bit about Nowa Huta.
So Nowa Huta literally translate as a new steelworks, if you were to translate it directly. That was a city that was built after the Second World War from scratch, from zero, that was supposed to be this ideal communist city. To show to the world how great the communist system is, that was the whole idea, was built right next to this. It was at a certain point the largest European steelworks. That still partly exists there. So there was a lot of money pouring there. There was no limits in terms of money, no limits in terms of space. So the architecture, there was sort of like social realist architecture, as you can see on the picture, but with those arches, with those balconies that, if you remember a few slides ago, we were seeing the courtyard of the royal castle. So amazing mix also of the architecture. Now it's kind of a blooming area, kind of trendy, and with a lot of greenery, with a lot of space, with a lot of like social aspects. So it is having its like second youth. But as Cameron said, yes, this is the place where you can learn the most recent Polish history, because literally you can go block by block, piece by piece, learn about the communism, how it all started. You can learn about everyday life, and you can also see a lot of symbols of the fall of the communism. And I think we have a slide on this one. Yes. So central square of this ideal communist city today bears the name of American President Ronald Reagan, who put the communism down. So such symbols, very ironic sometimes, let's be honest, history likes to be ironic sometimes, are all over the place. So really, really great place to learn about this more modern Polish history.
And one thing, Tomasz, when you've shown me around here, one thing that's impressive is from the outside, it looks kind of bleak and gloomy and it's big, but it's this people lived here and still live here. It's a very desirable place to live, and tucked back behind some of these sort of stern facades, you find these very charming little pockets of like playgrounds and really nice, relaxing places. This actually wouldn't, not only would this not have been a bad place to live under communism, it's not a bad place at all to live today. In fact, there's a lot of amenities there that I think make it quite nice.
That is true. It's very spacious. It's very green. It has a lot of like the social infrastructure. So kindergartens, daycare, schools, which in modern part of the city are more difficult to find. But underground, you find some of the like remains of the past, because just behind this beautiful and peaceful playground, we have ventilation shafts for the bunkers. Shelters that were built underneath, because remember, this was built during the Cold War times, where the threat of the attack, both conventional and nuclear, was very real on both sides. So around 90% of the buildings, they have those underground bunkers still.
Yeah, and you know, it's for those of us who this is within our lifetimes. I was in the 8th grade when we watched the Berlin Wall fall on television. And so I kind of have these vague memories of what the communist bloc or the Eastern Bloc kind of was supposed to have been like before that happened. And it's really fascinating to go as an adult and all these years later and walk around, and you have to recalibrate a little bit some of your assumptions when you actually see the way, you know, we were afraid of Soviet bombs, but Poles were afraid of that President Ronald Reagan, who's now honored on the main square, was going to drop a bomb on their hometown. You know, it's interesting to look back at this with the hindsight of history. Also, I forgot about this, but there's this really amazing modern church with a connection to St. John Paul II. Tell us a little bit about this church and about John Paul II, if you don't mind, Tomasz.
So Nowa Huta was supposed to be this ideal communist city, meaning with no religion whatsoever, okay, and no churches. However, still people living there that were kind of wanting a church, and eventually this church was built. This church is called the Ark of the Lord. If you look at it, its roof resembles a boat that is kind of floating on this on the water. It was a very clear like a message by the architects of Poland. We're talking 1970s, so still in the middle of this heavy communism. Poland floating on those like difficult seas of the communism, but as the Ark of Noah, it will eventually settle down on the free land. And this is what happened 12 years after this church was built. And the Bishop of Krakow, who consecrated this church and officially opened it in 1977, was Karol Wojtyła, in 1 year to become Pope John Paul II.
And that's the little statue you see there in front of the church is John Paul II. And then before we leave this part of Poland, one more side trip we wanted to mention. Actually, Tomasz wants to talk about this. As we said earlier, if you have a mental image of what Poland looks like, you might think it's a very flat country, and most of it is extremely flat farmlands. But there is this little ridge of beautiful mountains on the southern fringe. So Tomasz, this is your chance to talk people into checking out the mountains of southern Poland. Tell us a little bit about this area.
Yes, thank you for this opportunity. For me, it's one of my favorite parts of Poland are the mountains. And you're looking at the small town of Zakopane that is surrounded by the mountains. This is the highest part of the Carpathian range, that is, after Alps, the second largest range of the mountains in Europe. It's not only beautiful in terms of landscape, as you can see here, it's a beautiful in terms of culture. It's a beautiful in terms of activities that you can do both in summertime for a lot of trekking opportunities, wintertime, a lot of skiing, amazing wooden architecture that you can see on the picture. Some of the wooden churches are dating back to the oldest ones to 1490s. So we're talking Columbus times, and they are still standing in this area, beautifully located in the forest. So the place is just charming, whatever the weather is. It's a great place also for activities. Please take a look. You wouldn't expect that in Poland. Yes, it is in Poland. And also underneath the mountains, we have a lot of thermal waters that are now being used for those thermal spas that both in summertime and wintertime are a great place of relaxation. So you can combine your one-day visit to the mountains with a nice relaxation afterwards with such amazing views.
Yeah, I have yet to spend a lot of time here. I've been down a couple of times just to check it out years ago, and the weather wasn't very good. It was kind of socked in. So I haven't had the full Polish mountains experience, but one of these days I'm going to make a point to go in the summer and enjoy it. I hear amazing things about it. So that's good. We're going to move on now to another part of the country. We're going to go right to the center of the country, the capital city, the modern capital city of Warsaw. And it's the biggest city in Poland by far, and it feels like a big city compared to everything else we're seeing here. They're already big cities, Krakow and Gdańsk, but Warsaw is a very big city, and it feels it. And the icon of Warsaw is this giant skyscraper that was built under the communist period called the Palace of Culture and Science. And it's interesting. I always wonder. So I know you're not from Warsaw, Tomasz, but when someone of your generation looks at this, do you kind of say, this is an unwanted reminder of communism, or are you kind of over it and it's just part of the skyline? Tell us kind of what space this building occupies in the Polish imagination.
So you're looking at the Palace of Science and Culture, and for many of us, it's unfortunately the first version. Okay, it's unwanted gift from Stalin that was built here in the mid-1950s. Well, gift, when I say gift, I say like this because we had to pay for it anyway. So it's until very recently, it was the highest building in Poland. It's nearly 800 feet high. Now, it's a part of a skyline, definitely. It's a very important cultural center because there's a Congress Center, there are 2 theaters, movies, a lot of institutions that occupy the spaces within. And now it's on the list of the monuments. So it has been decided it will stay with us for longer.
So whether you like it or not, just like when you first got it, you're kind of stuck with it. So you might as well get used to it. It's interesting. There's a when you talk to Polish people, that's I like to ask those questions because people have different relationships with these things and all different kinds of ways of processing this little chapter. We tend to, I think for a lot of Americans, our view of Poland is dominated by this communist period. But when you look at the whole history of Poland, it was a very short period of the history. And these days, it's so far in the past that, a lot of times Polish people don't think about it until a visitor like us asks them about it. An important part of the history of Warsaw is that it was completely flattened after World War II. This is an artist's rendering of what it would have looked like right after World War II. Basically, Hitler was furious at Warsaw because there were a variety of uprisings against Nazi rule. And to punish Warsaw, essentially, he bombed it to the foundations as the Nazi army was withdrawing. But what I got to tell you is the city has been really beautifully rebuilt. And it's actually in parts, a very sophisticated, very beautiful European capital city. It maybe isn't quite as kind of perfect as it was during the interwar period between World War I and World War II. It was kind of this pristine, beautiful national capital that kind of was a trendsetter for all of Europe. And there's still some parts that were not built as nicely as this, but in general, there's a lot of beauty, a lot of pockets of great beauty in Warsaw. They reconstructed the old town. This was bombed flat, and they reconstructed it very precisely in a way that's really impressive. What I go to Warsaw for is partly for the cute old town, but I really like it as a place to really get in touch with modern Poland. It's a great place to, for example, explore the food scene. This is a market hall, one of these great food halls that you see popping up all over Europe these days, where you can go in and sample a couple of dozen different local restaurateurs, have little either fancy sit-down restaurants or little windows where you can try their food. Really wonderful. It's just a great place for me to get a taste of contemporary, modern, urban Poland. It's just a nice contrast in some ways to all the old world stuff that you get elsewhere. I also think Warsaw has some amazing sightseeing. This, for me, that you're looking at here is one of my favorite history museums anywhere in Europe. This is the Museum of the History of Polish Jews. And we talked in Kazimierz, in Krakow, and at Auschwitz. The sites there tend to be pretty dominated by the story of the Holocaust, which is important and very tragic. But for years, I always felt kind of disappointed because when you go to Poland and you learn about Jewish history, what you're really learning about is the Holocaust. But when this museum opened a few years ago, for me, it was a breath of fresh air because, of course, the museum discusses the Holocaust, but it also tells this whole beautiful story of the Jewish people in the Polish lands going back to the Middle Ages and how the Jewish society was interwoven with the dominant Polish society, Catholic Polish society, and how the two communities interacted with each other. This is a beautiful interior of a wooden synagogue that was recreated from a small town in the countryside. Tomasz, do you agree that this is kind of a good showcase for that very important part of the history?
Yes, I completely agree with you, Cameron. I think this is one of the best museums, and what is important is it's changing the perspective of the Jewish culture, because it's 1,000 years of this culture here in Poland. And if you think of Holocaust, it was just 6 years. So, of course, it talks about it, but it talks what was there before. You have to know that before the outbreak of the Second World War, Poland was the largest Jewish country in the world. In terms of number of Jews living in one country. So this is the story that is being told. You get to know a lot of tradition, you get to know a lot of the history. It's amazingly done. A lot of modern, high-tech explanations and touch screens that you can see and learn and touch and look. So really one of my greatest museums there. And yes, we take our guests there on the Poland tour, of course.
Yeah, that was the fun thing about designing this Poland tour, that we got to brainstorm and say, what do we think are really the best experiences and the best sites in Poland? And we got to string together exactly what we wanted to show people, including this. So another thing that we love to introduce people to on our tours and our guidebooks when they go to Poland is Friedrich Chopin. And for a lot of people, you might think, isn't Chopin French? Didn't he live in Paris? But what actually, when you study the life of this great composer, what you realize is he had a Polish mother, and he was born in Warsaw or near Warsaw. And he felt very culturally Polish until a certain point in history when he ended up moving to Paris because of certain complicated political issues. So even though he lived a lot of his life in France, He always was very nostalgic for his childhood in Poland. In fact, this is a beautiful statue in Łazienki Park, which is this great kind of modern park, urban park in the middle of Warsaw. And it depicts this idea that Chopin said when he played his music, even when he was in France, it reminded him of the wind blowing through the willow trees of his native land, Poland. And for this particular statue, this particular park is really a beautiful thing on a Sunday in the summer. They do these beautiful outdoor concerts where around this statue of Chopin, I mean, hundreds and hundreds, maybe even thousands of Varsovians come out and they fill this park and they listen to a pianist playing the music of Chopin in front of the Chopin statue. This is such a beautiful thing that when Rick and I were making our schedule for filming the TV show, our first draft, we realized we weren't here on a Sunday. And we said, we can't miss this. This is such a beautiful cultural expression of the Polish love for Chopin. So we rearranged the entire filming schedule to make sure we could be here on a Sunday in order to film this. It's important to do that. If you're not there on a Sunday, there are other ways to get a little taste of Chopin. And one of those is there's this wonderful little B&B that we love that does nightly Chopin salon concerts. And it was because the guy who runs it, his name is Jarek, you can see him here. He was frustrated. I've known him for 15 years or so. We put him in our guidebook years ago as a B&B. And he was frustrated because people would come to the city of Chopin and say, where's the concerts? And he would say, there isn't any concert tonight, unfortunately. So he started hosting the concerts himself. And this is a great example of just kind of the cultural pride you find in Poland. And we're really lucky to be connected to people like Jarek. In fact, when we decided to do our tour, we said, let's make sure we stay at Jarek's hotel. We have a nice sort of happy hour up on the rooftop deck looking out over the skyscrapers of Warsaw, where we introduce our tour members to Jarek, and he can kind of answer their questions about what it's like to be basically a Polish urbanite living in a big city in these kind of crazy times. And one thing that we really appreciate having partners like Jarek, on the first Poland tour last year, we had a dinner booked for a group at just a standard Polish restaurant that was going to be fine, but nothing special. And we felt like we could do something more. And so we talked to Jarek and he said, you know, a lot of the people in my kitchen that I employ are from Ukraine. A lot of them are even recent Ukrainian refugees. And I bet they would love to prepare a traditional Ukrainian dinner for your groups. And we just jumped at the chance and said that would be beautiful. And so sure enough, just pretty much on the spur of the moment, a couple of days notice, Jarek's Ukrainian kitchen staff prepared this amazing, not Polish, but Ukrainian traditional dinner. They were so proud to be able to cook their food from the heart. And Jarek even invited a local musician to come and play the local traditional stringed instrument, bandura, I think it's called, during dinner, which was really a very powerful experience. And it became an important part of our tours. I think we're going to be doing it again this year. But speaking of Ukraine, I think that's kind of the elephant in the room when we talk about Poland. So I think Tomasz and I, before we move on to our final destinations, we want to talk a little bit about what's going on in Ukraine and how it might affect considering a visit to Poland and how it's affecting the Polish people. And I'm going to start with just a little geography lesson, which is to say, yeah, Poland shares a border with Ukraine. And as you can see, Warsaw and Krakow, a couple of the places we just talked about, they're an hour and a half, 2-hour drive, maybe from Ukraine. And you might think, well, there's this horrible war that's going on in Ukraine. It can't possibly be safe to go to Poland. But I think this is a good chance to kind of recalibrate and get a new perspective and maybe an education in the modern realities of Europe. And one of the things I was thinking about is I think the reason people think Poland and Ukraine are so close together, they're basically the same thing, so Poland must be dangerous, is because when we think of Europe, some of us, we imagine the Iron Curtain, right? This was the Iron Curtain that separated the East and the West. And so anything that's sort of east of that line is part of the Soviet world, and it's all kind of the same, right? And I've really devoted a lot of my career, mainly through our guidebooks, to educating Americans about the fact that there's a tremendous amount of diversity and variety on the east side of that line. And actually, these countries don't have much to do with each other at all, other than a few cultural ties and historical ties. And that Poland is a very different place from Ukraine and from everywhere else. And these days, the current political reality is this is kind of the new Iron Curtain in a way, because everything to the west of this line is in the European Union and it's all in NATO. We were going to rename, by the way, our Eastern Europe guidebook. Rick and I just decided we're going to rename the next edition of this Central Europe, because people who live in the countries on the west side of this line, including Tomasz, feel very strongly that they're not Eastern Europeans, they're Central Europeans. They're fully integrated with Europe. And so if someone gets nervous about going to Poland because it's close to Ukraine, I kind of understand that. But when you look at this line, you realize if Putin were to cross this line and put someone in Poland in danger, that would be a much bigger problem than than you're on vacation when it's happening. That would mean that there's a pretty major crisis going on. So just from the geopolitical point of view, we've been kind of disappointed this year and last year that a lot of people aren't going to places like Poland or the Czech Republic or even Croatia or Slovenia or Hungary because they're close to Ukraine. And we've been running tours and sending independent travelers there this whole time. And every single one of them who goes to these countries comes back and they say, we're so glad we went. We felt perfectly safe and comfortable. We were a little nervous before we went, but now we realized that wasn't necessary. And in fact, when we took our tour members there, it was interesting to be walking through this Nowa Huta zone, and we saw this old Soviet tank, and it was kind of an interesting reminder that Poland knows what it's like to sort of be on the front line against the Russians. And this is a part of the world that's very comfortable with the position they have at kind of holding the European line in some ways. But I feel like I'm going on and on, but I'm actually curious to hear your point of view, Tomasz, as someone who lives here. I'll get off my high horse for a while, but tell us a little bit about what it's been like to live in Poland while this is going on kind of next door and how you've felt about it.
So everything you said is like very important, like to know and to repeat, because Poland is, we are an independent country. The border we share with Ukraine is more than the border with those two countries and the border of those two important worlds. So we feel kind of safe being a part of a NATO. And yes, Poland is safe. And all the people that have been traveling the past year, they can tell you that never ever for one moment they felt somehow endangered by the situation in Ukraine. On the opposite, coming here could be a sort of a sign of support, because you have to know that since last year, when the war broke out in February 2022, a little bit over 3.8 million Ukrainian refugees just crossed over the border to Poland. And it was, because as you said, we know what it's like to be attacked by Russia. We've been there. So the reaction from the Poles was very spontaneous. So we opened not only our hearts, but we also opened our homes. Everyone that I know that has like a room to rent was or is hosting someone. In my house, we already had like 4 families that that we hosted because they had nowhere to go, because sometimes they just arrived with their like plastic bag with a couple of personal things. Then their stories turned out differently. Some of them went more to Western Europe. 2 families returned to Ukraine as the situation started to stabilize. One, they loved Poland, so they decided to live here. And it's estimated around 40% of the Ukrainians that are coming here, they want to continue their life in Poland. So there's a lot of support going on from individuals, from institutions, and Ukrainian flags are not only hanging all over, but there's actually the real help of people helping into those particular people who just run away because they had nowhere to go, and Poland opened them with those open arms, hearts, and homes.
Yeah, it was very inspiring to be there. I was there last May most recently, and it was a couple months, 3 months after the invasion. And boy, it's just so stirring. And so, like you said, it was just so moving. I think people thought, the tour members said, are we going to be seeing a lot of refugee camps and people camping out? And you didn't see any of that, because all of the Ukrainians who came in had been rehoused. Somebody had taken them in, given them a guest room. They'd repurposed old buildings to turn them into accommodations for all of these desperate refugees. It's been really impressive to see the way that Poland has risen to the occasion. And just there's that solidarity. This is the trade union solidarity. And this was a poster I saw that reminded me that Poland is in solidarity with Ukraine. And I guess I'll just say, from a traveler's point of view, if you're thinking about going to Poland and you're nervous about it, no one has a crystal ball. We can't guarantee your safety. But I will say, having been there last year, going twice this year, it doesn't give me even the slightest bit of concern about it. In fact, it feels really good personally to be traveling in a country that's rising to the occasion and trying to help these desperately needy people. And this is a picture of Andrew. He's this wonderful driver that we've had in our guidebook for 15 or 20 years. And every day of the year, he takes people from the Rick Steves guidebook and does day trips with them to Auschwitz or side trips from Krakow or whatever. He's based in Krakow. And I went and saw him last May when I was in town. And I said, how's it going? He said, it's tough. He said, we had 2 years of COVID when our business completely dried up. And we thought 2022, like the rest of us in the travel industry, we thought this was going to be our year to rebound. And then this thing happened in Ukraine. And now we're going to have another year or maybe longer where we're going to have, really tight on business. And so I said, well, what are you doing instead? He said, well, when I don't have clients, because I don't have as many clients, he said, I load up supplies into my car and I drive them to the Ukrainian border and I volunteer my time and that gasoline to deliver supplies to Ukraine. And I just thought about the fact that there's something almost sort of ethical about supporting a country and people like Tomasz and like Andrew and all of these wonderful Polish people who are rising up and rising to the occasion and standing in solidarity and taking all these Ukrainians in. And for us to say, I don't want to go there because I'm a little nervous about it. I understand if you're concerned, but it sort of feels to me like it's the right thing to do in some ways. If you're on the fence, going to Poland, spending money there, supporting these people is the right thing to do because it is going to trickle down and help all of the Ukrainians who are there as well. Tomasz, do you think that's a fair, obviously, I'm speaking to the choir here, but do you have any final thoughts about this, or what would be the last word you'd give to Americans thinking about going to Poland?
So I remember, Cameron, like after your visit last year in May, you wrote a blog or how coming to Poland can actually support Ukraine. And a lot of people read that. And actually on my tour in September, I had people who read the blog and decided to sign up on the tour because of you. So thank you very much again for saying it out loud, for being such a great ambassador, and truly coming here could be like a great sign of support. Thank you.
And let me guess, those people had a terrible experience and went home wishing they'd never come to Poland, right?
Yeah, they said they were so happy they came. It was like one of the best decisions they have taken. So,
well, good. All right. Well, we'll get off our soapbox now, but I think that's a fair. It's worth delving into that a bit because there's something going on right now in our lives that's kind of unprecedented and kind of scary, and so it's important to think about it carefully when it's right next door to Poland. We're going to wrap up with a couple final destinations, and then we're going to take your questions in just a few minutes. So if you haven't put any questions in the Q&A widget, now would be a good time. Gabe and Ben are collecting those to share with us in a few minutes. But first, the last couple stops we want to make, one is up on the north coast of Poland, and this is the beautiful city of Gdańsk. And if you know your history, there was a time when this was known by its German name, Danzig, but these days it is a Polish city and it's called Gdańsk. This is, first of all, an incredibly beautiful city. This is kind of like, it feels a little closer even to Amsterdam or to Scandinavia, I think, than to what we think of as Poland, because it was part of the Hanseatic League of trading cities back in the Middle Ages and through the next several centuries. This was a major shipping center, so it had all these connections with all these Northern European cities. It was a very vibrant, diverse, eclectic society with just absolutely stunning architecture. I love that main square in Krakow. But this main street in Gdańsk, for me, is sort of neck and neck with Krakow's main square as just one of the most beautiful places in Poland. I just love strolling around. It's also got some great museums that tell you about this history. It's also got just some beautiful back streets. It's a fun city to just explore. So in addition to all that history, Gdańsk is just an enjoyable place. The other thing you might associate with Gdańsk is that back in the 1980s, this was the birthplace of the Solidarity movement, which was the first legal trade union, not initially legal, but later the first legal trade union that was allowed within the Soviet bloc. And the person that you might associate with that is Lech Wałęsa, who is this electrician who worked at these shipyards in Gdańsk, who basically led this strike that ended up having some real impact. It actually created some real reform that kind of slowly, gradually over the next decade started chipping away at the dominance of the Soviet regime, the Soviet-controlled communist regime here. Tomasz, tell me a little bit about, I mean, you were growing up kind of at this point. What are your memories of this period, of this sort of transition, slow transition out of communism?
So we use the word slow transition, but let's be honest, it was full of pain and suffering and victims and such. And like for me, like I was a child at that point, but I remember the moment when the communists kind of like wanted to put down the solidarity idea movement that was born in 1980. So in December 1981, they introduced martial law in Poland. That martial law, also in Polish, if you translated, like a state of war, literally. So there were tanks on the street. I remember this day was Sunday, and the Sunday was the only day where we had cartoons on TV, and there were no cartoons on that day. So young Tomasz remembers that way. And there was a curfew, you couldn't travel. There was a lot of people being arrested, and it lasted 2 years until 1983. But the momentum that the soldiers got even before that was so strong that it would not stop, and nothing would stop it. And eventually, 1989, 4th of June, this is the moment when we said goodbye to communism. This date was the date of this first free parliamentary election in the post-war Poland that kind of started the process of changes that, let's be honest, still continues until today, but the direction was set at that point. And I think the direction was set well.
And I will say in this picture, that big kind of rusted metal looking building in the background is a fantastic museum called the European Solidarity Center. And it's the state-of-the-art museum that tells the whole story of Lech Wałęsa, or as we say in English, Lech Walesa, and the way he helped start this trade union and led it. And this kind of, like he said, like Tomasz just said, it was not an easy process. There were fits and starts. There was like climbing a sand dune, right? You take a couple steps up and then you'd slide back 3 steps. But very gradually, over about a decade, they managed to end this communist system. And it was a very important moment for all of Eastern Europe. It was sort of the first kind of domino that toppled, that eventually ended up freeing all of Eastern Europe. Really, you could say started right here, not just in Poland, but right here in Gdańsk. In fact, right here in this exact place, you can stand at the gate of that shipyard, which was then called the Lenin Shipyard. And what basically during those original protests, Lech Wałęsa and all of these workers were behind the gate, and all of their family members would come to this side of the gate. It was the only place they could interact or get updates or find out what was going on inside. So this was the spot exactly here. We're basically the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union and communism. That's a drastic oversimplification, but you could really make a case. This was the first point at which the tide began to turn, and very slowly ended up having a chain reaction across all of Europe. It's amazing to stand in this place. And this is just a 15-minute walk from those beautiful old buildings that I just showed you. All of this is in Gdańsk, beautiful city. Just wrap up very quickly, a couple more towns. Just down the road from Gdańsk is a beautiful red brick town called Toruń. And as I said, we were saying earlier, there's not really a lot of charming small towns per se in Poland, but this is sort of, if you want something a little bit smaller, a little bit less urban, Toruń is just a very beautiful traditional town. It's famous for a lot of things, including its gingerbread. So with our tours, we take people to actually a hands-on gingerbread making demonstration. And it's also just a beautiful town to relax and enjoy yourself exploring. And then also very close to Gdańsk is a very impressive, amazing castle called Malbork Castle. It's the largest brick castle on earth. This was the headquarters in the Middle Ages of the Teutonic Knights who dominated this part of Poland. And it's a fascinating, fantastic castle to tour. The outside's amazing, and the inside also has some beautiful architecture. And it's a great place to kind of learn a little bit more about Polish history. I just wanted to remind you, we're going to wrap up here in a second and go to our Q&A. But before we do that, I just want to remind you, a lot of these pictures we're taking on this great Rick Steves tour. And we're about to find out from some of our colleagues in a minute a little bit more about that Best of Poland in 10 Days tour. But I specifically wanted to say, one of the joys of going on a tour, or if you can find these people as well, contacting them directly through our guidebooks, is connecting with local people. And you've just gotten a taste tonight in the last hour and 15 minutes or so of one of our wonderful European-based tour guides. And boy, as you've learned, having someone like Tomasz, this is his business partner with him, Monica, to take you by the hand and explain to you these stories of Poland and give you that insight just makes these experiences so special. Tomasz, before we kick it over to Ben to give us our Q&A, do you have any final thoughts or anything you want to impart to people who are thinking about going to Poland?
I would say just keep calm and come to Poland.
Well said. Ben, I'm going to hand it off to you, and we're going to sit tight and be ready for your questions in a minute.
All right. Thank you so much, Cameron and Tomasz. I'm so grateful that we were able to dedicate this time to Poland, and I appreciate so much your deep dive into the history, culture of the country. Well done.
Well, thanks for having us.
It's my pleasure. Before we get to some Q&A that Gabe and I have been scanning during your presentation, I would like to present tonight's word from our sponsor. And as you mentioned earlier, we get to learn more about the Poland tour, the itinerary, from two of the people who helped design it, our coworkers, Casey and Robin.
Hi, I'm Casey Gould. I work in tour operations, managing the Best of Poland itinerary. I work with our local Polish partners and friends.
And I'm Robin Stencil. I was the product manager when we were developing the tour.
And we're happy to present to you today the Best of Poland in 10 days tour. Starting in Gdańsk, we'll spend 2 nights, and we continue on with a stop at the Malbork Castle before arriving at our next destination, Toruń, where we sleep for 1 night. We continue on for a 3-night stay in Warsaw, and finally stop at Jasna Góra Monastery on our way to Krakow, finishing the tour.
And one of the things that I liked the most about putting this tour together was being able to showcase all of Poland's best sites from north to south.
Yes, and the thing I love about this itinerary is it's so experience rich, from vodka tasting to gingerbread and pierogi making, as well as getting a really deep, meaningful experience of the Jewish history. This tour is jam-packed, and I also really appreciate being involved in this itinerary because, like some of our tour members, I have Polish roots myself.
If you've ever been to Krakow and are curious for more, or if you've never been to Poland at all, this is the tour for you.
We invite you to join us on the Best of Poland. Nostrovia!
All right, thanks to Casey
And
Robin.
I'll just interrupt to say that we're just so lucky with all these great people we get to work with here at Rick Steves Europe. We call ourselves the merry band of travelers. And sometimes people like me get sort of the spotlight, but we're representing a whole team of 100+ people in Edmonds and about 150 tour guides like Tomasz all over Europe. We're just 2 of the people that are part of this wonderful team. And Robin, who you saw in that video, it was really fun working with her to design the Poland tour because she was just up for brainstorming. She and I would sit down and we'd get suggestions from all of our Polish guides, and we would sit down and spread out a map of Poland and brainstorm and where can we find a good open air folk museum, and should we include this, or can we do a detour to fit this in? And she just worked tirelessly to come up with this amazing itinerary. And then Casey is the one who manages it day to day, year to year now. She's the one in touch with all of our contacts over there to make sure everything's smooth. And I got to say, between the 2 of them, Tomasz will attest to this. When we did that first tour last May, you would have thought it was the 100th time we did that tour. Everything came off without a hitch. It was super smooth. The only problem we had was we kept getting places earlier than we thought we would because we overestimated how long the drives would be. But in terms of everything that Robin and Casey set up, it just worked perfectly. And we're just very lucky to be a part of that team.
Well said, Cameron. All right, I have some excellent questions here. We'll start with a selection of practical travel questions. Alan is wondering, as are several others, when is the best time of year to go to Poland?
Tomasz, why don't you take that?
So you could answer to this in different ways. In terms of the weather, I would suggest April, May, June, then September, October, because it's warm but not too hot. However, in terms of other things, you have to know that most of the travelers, both in Poland and in Krakow, are locals, Polish people, schools traveling. So coming in those months, you also have more people. Coming in July and August, it's empty. No lines to museums. So you may reconsider. And also wintertime gives you completely different perspective. Not only super empty museums and great rate for the hotels, but also some of the winter traditions, like the one that we spoke about, nativity scenes. It's only there in December. So I guess the choice is yours. In wintertime, even though it's cold, but we have our ways to warm you up, so no worries.
And Cameron, how is public transportation in Poland? Is it possible to travel in the country without a car or joining a tour?
Yeah, I almost never rent a car in Poland. That's one of the kind of positive heritage of communism. They had a really well-developed transportation system, and sometimes it's slow, but it'll get you there. And actually, these days they've replaced a lot of the slow train lines with express trains. I remember it used to be 4 or 5 hours to go from Krakow to Warsaw, and now it's down to, I want to say 2 hours, maybe 2.5 hours. So I rarely rent a car in Krakow, in Poland. There are places where it's nice to have a car. So in Krakow, people like to either have a car or, like I showed you, Andrew, a few minutes ago, you hire maybe a local driver, a local guide to do some of the day trips that are a little trickier by public transit. So if you want to go to Auschwitz for the day, or if you want to go to Zakopane into the mountains, that's possible, but a little more time consuming by public transport. So rather than have a car for the whole thing, I would say do it by train and then think ahead about, do I want to hire a car or a driver for certain strategic places? Another thing that's very popular in Poland is tracking down family heritage. We talked about, a lot of us have Polish ancestry. That's a case where you're getting off into the countryside. Not only do you want some transportation help, but you want some translation help and somebody who has some know-how about how to find answers to your questions. And so that's a case where this picture that I showed you of Andrew, he's one of many great local guides with cars or drivers or translators who can help make sort of that sort of thing easier.
Well, that's perfect, Cameron, because ideas on researching Polish genealogy was one of my other questions. So,
well, and I'll just follow up. I'll say a little more about that, which is, if you're thinking about that, do a little research before you leave home. Because I did this myself a few years ago, and we actually, with my parents, we tracked down the ancestral villages where my family came from. It was the Wutzaj family from Kraków and the Dąbrowski family from Wałruda. And we had done a little research. We dug around some of my grandma's old handwritten notes, and we figured out the names of our great grandparents who were born there. It helps to know what you can about birth dates, marriage dates, immigration dates. If you have any list anywhere of some of the villages or towns that some of your ancestors might have lived in, anything like that can be very helpful. And then once you get there, especially if you're working with someone who knows what they're doing, it's not that hard to piece it together, hopefully. And I'll just tell you one quick story about that. We went to this little tiny crossroads village of Kraków, where my great grandmother came from. The family name was Wutzaj, and Andrew was driving us, and we pulled over in front of the one store in the town of Kraków, and there were a couple of guys hanging out front drinking beers. And Andrew just walked up to them and said, "Do you know anyone by the name of Wutzaj?" And these two guys started pointing at every house in the village. "Oh, Wutzaj, Wutzaj, Wutzaj." And it turned out we still had all these relatives with distant cousins who had the same family name living in the same village. So it's super satisfying to do that. But you do need to find, what was your grandma or your great grandma's maiden name, anything like that. What town were they born in? Anything like that will help make that an easier experience.
Fantastic. That's great advice, Cameron. Tomasz, we touched on this briefly earlier. Kathy, Christine, and others are curious, how expensive is travel in Poland today, do you think?
How expensive is traveling in Poland? Generally, even though prices are rising in Poland as everywhere in the world, but still, I think Poland is one of the most price valued country. So especially in terms of accommodation, in terms of food, you will find it really surprising how nice the prices are. So make good use of it while it's still there.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you do too, Cameron. John is curious. Cameron, Tomasz, perhaps each of you might have some suggestions. What are the best Polish cities for Christmas markets?
I'll defer to Tomasz. I've never been there at Christmas time.
Well, now Christmas markets are in different parts of Poland, and many cities organize it, but definitely come to Krakow. I'm not only saying that because I'm from Krakow, but remember, Christmas market is organized on this largest medieval market square of Europe. So imagine all those amazing monuments that we just saw on the slides. There are now with all the Christmas decoration and those wooden stalls and this glue wine and hot beer. This is also something that we drink in winter time. May sound strange, but yes, it's warm beer with some spices and some raspberry syrups. It's just amazing. It's the place that we still go to. So definitely Krakow.
Now, forgive me if you did mention this earlier and I missed it, but we do have a quick couple questions about it. Scott and others are asking about the milk bar. Cameron, can you tell us about milk bars?
Yeah, we didn't mention it yet, but a milk bar, it started off, and Tomasz, you can tell us about the history of it, but it started off as basically a government subsidized cafeteria. It's kind of a misnomer. It's basically like a cafeteria serving hearty portions of very traditional Polish food. not just milk. But it started off as a communist government subsidized way that people could get a meal out. They didn't really have fancy restaurants, of course, back then. And even though communism is long since forgotten, there's still this beautiful tradition throughout Poland of very affordable self-service cafeterias. They tend to be really designed for Polish people. Sometimes there's not much English at all, or they're like, it's all posted in Polish. And if you ask, they might have some tattered photocopied English menu you can borrow. But I will say that, speaking of good value, I agree with Tomasz. Poland is an amazing value. And the food in particular, and especially at a milk bar, you can get a very filling traditional Polish meal for $5 or $6, honestly, and really good food. Tomasz, tell us, as someone who's from Poland, how does that fit into your kind of dining out experience?
So milk bars, bar mleczny, as we call it, we literally translate into milk bar, has always been with us. And as you said, it's like a relatively like low-key cafeteria where the food is ready, so you don't wait for it. So this is an advantage. When you're in a rush, you just go there and they put the food on the plate, okay? You don't wait at all. Self-service. Its quality depends on the place. So those places are not always the cutest ones. So they have some like plastic tablecloths, let's say, and so on. Especially if you are out of the center of the touristy areas, they will be like super local. You'll be probably the only foreigner inside, being the one of the biggest attraction there. So they're still all over the place. And yes, something that we still do use when we, let's say, run, when we don't have a time for a very like proper meal, you just use those. Now there are some like modern restaurants opening and naming themselves milk bars, which can be kind of tricky. So it's not only the name, you just have to go inside and see it for yourself.
Great. I love milk bars. Yeah. We have time for just one more question, and perhaps we can hear from each of you on this. David asks, is Poland an okay destination for someone who's never traveled outside of the US before?
I think for sure. And in fact, it's interesting. One of our tour members on that tour last May had never set foot outside of the US, and Poland tour was his first time in Europe. I think first time internationally traveling, except for Canada, maybe. So that's an endorsement right there. Look, I mean, I would have said maybe 20 years ago, there were some maybe rougher edges. There was a little less English spoken. It was a little more intimidating. But I would say these days, in my opinion, Poland is every bit as accessible, as English friendly, and as easy to get around as anything in Europe. And I would argue there are parts of that you might think of as more accessible, like maybe Spain or Greece, that are probably harder to get around and more challenging than you would find in Poland. So yeah, I would say I wouldn't hesitate to consider Poland as a first time in Europe. What do you think? What do you think, Tomasz?
I'm kind of difficult for me to switch from the perspective of not being Polish, but I would say, as Cameron just mentioned, it's very accessible. It is very friendly, and you have to know one thing: we Poles, we have this Polish hospitality in our blood, in our veins. We are just open. This is something that we do naturally. So you will see a lot of great people like working as waitresses in the hotels and so on. You'll be very welcome. You will feel very welcome. So I think for the first encounter with Europe, this is a very nice like first impression. So definitely you will have that in Poland.
I agree. You know, when I went to study abroad in 2016, I had never been outside of the US before, and off I went to Krakow for 6 months with no international experience whatsoever, a little 20-year-old Ben, and it was life-changing, but the safety and the good resources in Poland made it possible and a great experience. So I absolutely agree. I think Poland is a good place to go, even if you're a first-time international traveler. All right, well, that's all we have for tonight. Thank you, Cameron. Thank you, Tomasz. That hat is fabulous. So dziękuję bardzo to both of you.
Thank you for having us. And thank you, Tomasz. It's getting on to close to 3 o'clock in the morning there. So we especially appreciate you staying up late for us, Tomasz. Dziękuję bardzo, I should say.
Dziękuję bardzo. It was a pleasure taking you on this virtual trip to Poland. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. And thank you to all of our fellow travelers tonight for exploring Poland with us. We look forward to hopefully having you join us again next week for Prague. Good night, Cameron. Good night, Tomasz.
Good night, Ben.
Night.
Notes, Tomasz.